We're going to be looking at poverty, education, and technology this coming week. And I guess the first thing to consider is that poverty comes in a lot of shapes and sizes. Poverty is not in any one country. It is not any one race. It is not in any one culture. But there are cultures where there is less poverty and cultures where there is more poverty. And the other thing to consider is that technology offers us some ways to mitigate the effects of poverty. Technology itself is often considered to be one cause of poverty because of, for example, in our country, we think about technology eliminating jobs, taking jobs overseas because of long-distance communication technology and things like that. But as we will see, some of the big disadvantages for poverty in learning have to do with lack of access. And done well, technology can increase access to information, even to economic development, to people in poverty. So again, like in so many things, technology is interestingly interwoven in our topic. Okay, let's just think for a little bit about why are we talking about poverty in a class on diversity, learning, and technology? As we said, poverty is not a culture. A culture needs to be a self-identified group of people. But poverty certainly impacts culture. And poverty changes the effect of culture. You can hardly say that the people who live in gated communities in this country live in the same culture and have the same opportunities and all the rest, and the same opportunities, especially for learning, that people who live in areas of concentrated poverty that we often call slums or inner cities or deep rural areas, things like that. So let's first of all look at poverty in an ever-contracting circle. Let's look at world poverty first. And the best figures that I could get on world poverty so far are around 2012. So you're looking at 870 million people. 1 in 8 people in the world suffer from chronic undernourishment. And the number of hungry people has been falling overall in the world, but unfortunately poverty is becoming increasingly concentrated, and undernourishment and hunger is becoming increasingly concentrated in Africa. And that's one of the things that we are very much hoping that we can find technologies to deal with. Okay, nearly half the world's population lives on less than $202.50 a day. That's nearly half. And more than 1.3 billion live in what we would call extreme poverty, what is defined by UNICEF as less than $1.25 a day. Now, poverty is not just, of course, the amount of money you have. Money's just a symbol, a trading good, a marker for access. So we've already talked about hunger and the fact that hunger still stalks the world. 1 in 8 people are suffering from chronic undernourishment. But we also have people who lack access to electricity and other modern forms of energy. 1.6 billion of the world's people. Okay? 1 billion children worldwide live in poverty, and according to UNICEF, 22,000 of them die every day due to disease and malnutrition that is directly related to poverty. So worldwide, poverty is a major issue. Let's look at this country. We often think that we're doing better in this country. Not so much, maybe. About 40 million people in 2016. These are mostly 2016 figures. Almost 13% lived under the official poverty level, and you can see what those amounts are. I want you to notice a few things. I'm not going to read through all these. But notice the disproportionate effect on people of different ethnicities. less than 10% of whites, over 20% of black people. 21% of children under 18. Children bear the burden of poverty much more. And children who live in families with only a mother as head of the household are 4 times more likely to be in poverty. 20% almost of children lived in food insecure households. 6% had no health insurance, which means very little health care. Over 1 million students in our country were homeless at some point, or in temporary housing such as temporary housing like motels, staying in somebody's living room, that kind of thing, shelters. And almost 10% of children in our country, that's almost 1 in 10, live in families with incomes that are below 50% of the poverty level. That's the one that blows me away. Okay, so imagine a family of 4 with less than $12,000 income a year. Okay, now let's narrow our vision just a little bit more. Many of us in this class live in Georgia. Not all of us, but many of us. The majority. In Georgia, the poverty rate is distinctly higher than in the rest of the country. It is, again, disproportionate in the same way. 1 in 4 children lives officially in poverty. Okay? 1 in 5 lives in a food insecure household. In other words, they don't know always where their next meal is coming from. Over 6% have no health insurance. 2% plus were homeless or in temporary housing. And 10% live in families with incomes less than 50% of the poverty level. So if you're in a school and you're teaching, say, I don't know, a class of, 35 kids, there's a 1 in 2 chance that one of your kids is homeless. There's a likelihood that 3 or 4 of your kids live in families with incomes less than half of the poverty level. And it's likely that it is likely that a quarter of your kids live in poverty. So poverty is going to affect learning and education hugely. Now, of course, the statistics I just said are averages. In some schools, it's hardly anybody, and in some schools, it's more than 50% of kids that live in poverty. So it shifts a lot. Why does this matter? Well, on average, kids in poverty just don't learn very well. This is the statistics from the 2015 NAEP for free and reduced eligible kids, which is how they break it down. Those who are eligible for free and reduced lunch live within 200% of the poverty level, and those that are not eligible, and you can see the difference. In 4th grade, 21% reached proficient, and 44% were below basic amongst the kids who are in low income, versus 52% who reached proficient and less than 20% below basic. And you can see all those statistics all the way up. It's a stunning difference. Why is this? Well, poverty affects children's ability to learn in a lot of ways. And it's not just the direct effects. It's like a concentric set of circles of effects. You have direct effects, you have family-mediated effects. There are effects mediated by the kind of communities that most poor people live in, and then societally mediated effects. So let's just look at a few of these. Now, you can read all these when you want to, but let's just look at a few. Okay, the direct effects. Kids in poverty are hungry. They don't get as good dental care. Have you ever tried to learn with a toothache? They get poorer health care. They have fewer educational resources available to them in the home. They're exposed to fewer things. One of you wrote last week about you said in your school, like most of the kids, the majority of kids have never been to a city that's only 30 miles away. So restricted exposure, and restricted exposure means you don't have as much past knowledge to draw on when you're trying to learn. There are fewer books in their homes. They watch more TV, which turns out to be, we've measured it, bad for kids. and they have less internet access. Okay, so they're all those things, but let's look at some of the family-mediated effects that we might not be thinking about. Families in poverty have less adequate child care. It's less safe, but it's also not going to be the preschool that gets you ready for kindergarten and stuff. They live in inadequate and dangerous housing, which means that kids in poverty are more likely to suffer from housing-related things like asthma, mold-induced allergies, those kinds of things. We have evidence that families in poverty actually talk with their children less. There's an article called 30 Million Words that shows in their study, and it has been challenged, but in their study, families living at the welfare level in poverty talk to their children. The children in those families heard less than half of the words of families that were better off, that were at professional level, okay? And the other thing that is really stunning is there is much more family stress. Family stress due to, if you aren't sure where the money's coming from and you're worried you're going to get evicted and your health, you don't have health care, that stresses out the whole family, which leads to more negative family interactions, more angry talk. And again, we have research showing us this. Less parental time for children because the parents are caught up in these things, and also just the physiological and psychological effects of stress, which are not good for the brain. We know that families, low income and families in poverty, the parents tend to read less themselves and they read less to their kids. And families all often move a lot. And if you don't have reliable transportation, tardiness and absence are much more likely, along with poor medical care. So you can see all of these things affecting children's abilities to learn, okay? And children who end up homeless or transition in and out of homelessness are especially affected. And remember, in Georgia, that was over 2% and nationwide. So that means 2 out of every 100 kids in the average school. Okay, let's look at community-mediated effects. Children in poverty tend to live in communities that do not help them learn. Susan Newman did a wonderful study talking about the fact that books are, here's the one on the bottom here, books are less likely, books and all kinds of printed material are less likely to show up in poor communities. The libraries, even when the library system is the same system, are less well stocked. They have fewer books and older books, but even the stores have fewer books and magazines in them. Even the signs have fewer words on them. So kids in poverty are exposed to less environmental print. They have increased personal danger and stress, and because of that, they're less allowed to go out and play autonomously. They can't run around the neighborhood free. And again, we know that that has cognitive benefits to kids. There are inadequate civil services. You're looking at garbage. You're looking at slower police response time, slower ambulance response time, slower fire response time. There is more traffic in poor neighborhoods, which leads not only to danger from traffic and fewer places to play, but also higher pollution. There is one of the things you'll be looking at is from Jonathan Kozol, and he has spent a lifetime researching the disparities between schools in poor and well-off neighborhoods. His most famous and first book was Savage Inequalities. You may have heard of it. But the difference between the resources of schools in poor areas and well-off areas does not need to be exaggerated in any way. Okay? There's higher pollution in poor neighborhoods because that's where they put polluting things, and because poor people tend to live where rents are low, which is near polluting things. And again, as I said, you have higher health problems, asthma, mold exposure, dangerous exposure to chemicals, all those kinds of things. There's the schools, which are in worse shape. Okay, so that's all community mediated. Now let's look at societally mediated effects, which are the causes of many of the ones we've already looked at. One of the things you're going to look at is a video on wealth inequality, which is now a number of years old, and the disparities have only grown greater. So when you watch that video, which always blows me away every time I watch it, think to yourself, okay, and it's gotten worse. We are in an era where wealth inequality, the difference between the wealth that a few people have and the poverty that many people have, is growing bigger and bigger. Zoning practices. Poor neighborhoods are not protected as rich neighborhoods are from dangerous zoning and pollution. Underfunded public defenders. One of the things going on in Georgia right now is that people are trying to eliminate the cash bail laws for misdemeanors, because cash bail laws sound like they're fair because it's the same bail for everybody roughly, right? But they're not fair, because if you don't have okay, let's say your bail is set at $10,000, not that unusual. You need $1,000 to give to the bail bondsman, which you will lose forever, by the way, if you want him to put up the $10,000 bail. If you don't have that $1,000, you stay in jail. If you stay in jail, your kids all of a sudden don't have anybody to take care of them if you're a single parent. You lose your job if you're put in jail. Your job isn't going to be waiting for you when you come back out. And so you sink further into poverty. Whereas someone who is in the middle class can probably raise that $10,000 to put down for bail by themselves. They can certainly raise that $1,000. And if they raise the whole $10,000, they don't lose any money at all. We're looking at inadequate consumer protections, media stereotypes of poor people. And you will hear over and over again from people, I see those people buying steaks with their food stamps. I can't afford steaks. All those kinds of things. I just had that conversation in my Sunday school, actually. There's a lot of stereotype and public prejudice. We just talked about debt laws. In this country, in many states, you can actually be put in prison for not being able to pay fines and things like that. So a traffic fine you can go to jail for. And again, that disrupts your whole life. Unfair voting practices. Local governments don't respond as much to poor people because poor people don't have as much clout. A lot of that has to do with the fact that our political campaigns are getting extremely expensive. And so the people with the money are the ones who control the campaigns. So you can see how this whole thing is like this whole conglomerate of things that affect poor kids and their learning. A couple of the pictures here, especially to look at, the little kid wearing the Flint hat. You all remember how the water in Flint was contaminated by lead because of an attempt by the state-assigned city supervisors to save a little bit of money? Well, lead impacts your ability to learn permanently. Also, kids in poor areas go to schools where there are far greater police presence in the schools, far more violence, far more other things. So you can see how the whole thing is just sort of a nexus. Now that I've been as depressing as possible, what we're going to look at in class when we meet is what can we do about this? It's important to say that difficult, hard, is not hopeless. And I'll leave you with a couple of quotes. One is from Nelson Mandela. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural, it's man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of individuals. And another quote from someone anonymous, but I think it's a good idea, and that's kind of where we're going to look when we meet again next Monday. Instead of thinking, how can students in poverty do better in school as though it's their problem? We need to be thinking about how can we restructure schools and societies so that kids in poverty can learn better. Because, when you're 5 and you walk into kindergarten, it isn't your fault. So, that's where we're going with it. You've got some great stuff to read about the problems, but also the solutions. So don't let yourself get bogged down. There are big problems. There are some things we can do. Can we solve the whole problem? I don't want to be that optimistic, but there are so many better things that we could do than what we're doing. And that's where we're going to go. Bye-bye. Have a good week.